So the way it has been working is we have starting speeches from every candidate, and then you ask questions. I've said to those who couldn't make it, the parties who couldn't make it, could they please send a representative? Some have been, to be honest, I mean, I'm independent. I honestly, hand on heart, I've voted for probably every political party, not every, but most of them over the years. I can hand on heart say that. But honestly speaking, the only party that hasn't really sent a representative so far is Labour. Rejoin EU haven't either. The candidate is sick. They're a much smaller party. And Lib Dems have come. The Tory candidate has been actually very good at turning up. He rang me twice today. He was so apologetic he couldn't make it. He tried to get someone to stand in for him, and it wasn't possible. So he really has tried. And the Reform UK candidate has been very, very good at coming as well. Green Party, he's confirmed that he will send a representative tomorrow who is very au fait with the green issues. He stood for Parliament himself. So that's happening tomorrow. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask?
Of course.
I thought these were kind of like the official hustings. I'm just really surprised that it's kind
well,
of like
I don't think there's any such thing as an official.
They're not coming, you know.
Yeah. Well, they're all aware. They've been made aware of this for a long time.
Right.
Yeah. So it's
It speaks volumes, especially the Labour candidate.
I'm getting a little bit.
I think she's already won it. I think.
That seems to be the impression I'm getting. It took, honestly, I've emailed every day. I've falling short of turning up at her doorstep and knocking on her door. I rang the Labour Party office, managed finally to speak to someone, said please, even if she can't come, can she send a representative? Last night people were getting quite shirty, to be honest, not at me, because I'm doing my best, but saying please, why can't she send someone? So I emailed her today saying, I'm sorry to tell you, but people are getting annoyed now that the Labour Party isn't sending someone. Could you please send someone? So that message has gone to her, and I will continue to send that message to Fleur at some point. So can we start with Heiko, if you can give us your intro.
Okay, given the circumstances, I want to explain how the electoral process is working, because I've never stood for a Member of Parliament before, and so the process itself has been informative for me, and I think telling you what's been going on will give you an idea about the state of democracy in this country today. So first of all, when they announce the election, you get the chance to get 10 signatures, which actually was a lot easier than I thought it would be, and you pay £500, and then once you're announced as a candidate, either as an individual, an independent, or with the political parties, you go down to the town hall after printing out the leaflet, you get 10 nominations, and as soon as you present yourself to the town hall, they will send you a list of the database of everybody who's on the voter registration in the constituency. So I got an email list of a database of 52,000 people in the constituency. And then you go and get 10 of them who are registered two of them to nominate, and then 8 of them to put their names underneath it as well. So it's basically, you ask them, are you prepared to support me standing? You don't have to vote for me, but the right for me to stand. So that's the process, and that process is relatively simple, relatively easy. So any of you who want to stand in future an election, that's what you do. That's how you get on the ballot paper. And for parliamentary candidate, you pay £500. Then, how do you get your message out to the public? Obviously, the existing major parties have got money behind them. They've got an impetus, they've got a background, they've got on the news, they're in the television, they're known, and therefore they have an enormous advantage. And that advantage means that a new party or an individual can only make so much of a mark in a period of a few weeks between the date the election's called and the actual voting day. So what do? They all talk on television about door knocking, go around and knock on the doors. Well, you've got a job. If you want to knock on 52,000 doors, that's a lot of doors to knock on and to find the people in. And therefore, you're dependent to make your mark and to distinguish yourself on one single process. And that process is known as the Royal Mail mail-out. Some of you might have received letters from your the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, possibly another party. Basically, you pay £1,500 to produce 52,000 letters, mine are an A4 leaflet, and that is sent in a folded form, in an envelope, to every voter in the constituency. You can choose alternatively to have it sent to every house in the constituency, but then it doesn't have a name on it. So obviously a name is a little bit better. So I've done this. I've paid £1,500 and got the leaflets made, and the leaflets are distributed for free. So this is a big democratic concession, that you get a leaflet, that's your equal status with others. Provided you pay the 500 and the 1,005, you will get a letter to every constituent. That's a very democratic process. Then, when I asked the returning officer or the election officer in Wandsworth, who was very helpful, what is the process to go about getting meeting rooms? And he told me that he sent me a list of all the meeting rooms that are available in the borough for free, except for the cost of heating, lighting, and the question of staffing is going to be a moot point. I'll explain about that in a little while. That's according to the 1983 Representation of the People's Act that guarantees the right to hold meetings in publicly funded buildings, like this one here. Now, I contacted, having got this list of 30 different buildings where you're allowed to hold meetings, I contacted all of those buildings and I asked them, can we hold debates? Can we hold hustings? And you can do two types of hustings. One type of husting is a selective husting, so it could be that I stand here and present my point of view, which was not the intention of tonight's meeting at all. I much prefer a debate with others. I thank God if Peter turns up, because otherwise it looks partisan and manipulative. But you can call a meeting. I could call a meeting of the Workers' Party in a room like this, and I would be legally entitled to rent the room at a massively discounted rate. This particular institution rented it to me for 2 days, 2 events, for £72. So this is a very good rate. No one's going to dispute. The library, however, they were really confused. They'd never heard of such an idea. Hold a meeting during an election, get a discount. So they sent me a bill for £900. I couldn't afford £900. I pointed out to them I had to pass the message on to the council official who deals with elections, and he sent back an email to the library and said, you can only charge for heating, lighting and so on. And then they sent me a revised bill for £350. Still a fair whack, but we've got 6 meetings there, so to be fair, that's not too outrageous. And the meeting room was excellent meeting room to hold a meeting in, and appropriate for the numbers of people we've been getting. Then a lot of the schools, they privatised the utilisation of the buildings in the evenings for renting out. So if you want to rent out a room, for example, in the Southfields Academy or St Celia's school, or there's another academy, can't remember the name of it actually, up by Arc Academy, that's right, good brain, Arc Academy. And the Arc Academy turned around to me and said, yeah, it's rented through a private enterprise. And the private enterprise I contacted, you go on a website, you book the room, they got a beautiful theatre there, so it's great. You can hold a big theatre meeting, discuss with all the candidates, have great debates. And I booked the room online with this private company because, of course, you can only rent the room on days when it's free. So you have to know it's free. So the only way I could know it's free is by booking it as if it was a private booking, and then turning around to them and saying, under electoral law, I'm allowed to have this for only the cost of heating and lighting, and perhaps staffing. And they then turned around and said, what do you mean? You're getting it for free? How can you get a room for free? I said, well, that's the election law. I said, it's not my fault. And they were really, really reluctant and unhappy and angry that I was able to get the room effectively for free under election law. And this was a battle. I spent 3 days at the beginning of the campaign constantly on the phone or on the email trying to contact and get past this bureaucracy created, 1 by the actual institution and 2 by the privatised process. So even though by law, and by the way, lots of the places that used to be available were publicly owned, for example, community centres or things like that, they no longer exist. And because of that, the number, which perhaps might have been in the past 100 different buildings in Putney constituency that you would be able to use, has gone down to 30, and actually of them, only 4 were actually available to be used. Now, other hustings take place, because you asked about official husting. This is an official husting. The other hustings, for example, the one that took place in St Barnabas, the one that took place in St Mary's Church, and the one that took place in South Thames College. The South Thames College one I organised because I used to go there, so I talked to them. But those aren't official hustings, because they're not called under Representation of the People's Act. This is an official husting under Representation of the People's Act, because it was rented on that criteria and on that basis. And so what you basically have is huge barriers put in the way of independent parties and independent candidates from actually making any mark on what happens in the constituency, unless you've been campaigning for ages. Okay, next, if there was another election in a year's time, or in 2 years' time, 5 years' time, I would know where we're at, and I would be prepared to move, straight away. But you've got to learn these things on earth. You're basically trying to fly while building the aeroplane. That's effectively what you're doing. And everything is done to hinder your ability to debate. Now, the debates that happened in St Mary's Church and in St Barnabas were great, because all the candidates were there, and the candidate that's to be anointed, or that they hope will be anointed, basically could just reel off the things she's done, and they could have a little debate about who did what about in one area of town. Some angry constituents complained. In actual fact, a lot of this is, in my opinion, a chimera. It's a fog to make people think that they have some control through the MP over what happens really in the local area. And the local MP tries to make out that they have a lot of control over what happens. In actual fact, it's the council, if anybody, who's responsible for local area decisions, and the MP has no financial power to carry out any changes whatsoever within the constituency. All they can do, he or she, is put a face to it and say, I support your campaign. That's all they can actually do. Now, it may have some influence, and certainly I've written to my MPs in the past, and I've had a complaint letter or raised an issue, and they've sent the letter straight to the minister, or straight to the person in charge, and you get a letter back from the leading figure, or from the head of the police, or something of that nature. And so this is the process that actually exists in British politics today, in the process of standing for election. So I wanted to make it clear to you what the barriers are, what the hindrances are, and also perhaps to indicate to you that independence is not that difficult to stand, but the processes are designed to hinder you from having much chance of winning. Now, I'm standing for the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party, as you know, George Galloway is the leader of the Workers' Party. He got elected in February this year because he stood up on the question of Gaza. In my opinion, I'm going to give my more political speech, part of the speech. In my opinion, Gaza is the issue of our time. Just the same as if in 1942 or 43 there were an election and people had known about what was happening to the Jews in the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, or in occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and it was felt that the government was doing nothing about it, or was aiding and abetting the Nazis in exterminating the people, then I think the people nowadays, they would think back, well, people would have risen up. People would have said, enough is enough. We can't tolerate this. And that's how George Galloway won the vote in Rochdale in February. And you may remember Rishi Sunak, I keep saying Rishi Starmer, Rishi Sunak came out onto the lectern in front of Number 10 that night, and he declared, our country is heading into crisis, extremism, horrors are confronting our country. And he made a very eloquent speech. It was very eloquent. I didn't agree with a word of it, but it was a very eloquent speech. He was horrified by the fact that George Galloway had been elected. And then when he made his speech on the wet bucket competition, when he called the election, people have asked me, why did he call that election? And I believe it's because there is a polarisation in British politics, which will hopefully be reflected today with the arrival of the Reform candidate, in that the Workers' Party on the one side is proposing an alternative to the deadpan, wooden Labour Party, which is offering nothing, as the German philosopher said, from nothing, with nothing, to nothing, George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. They are offering nothing to the people, and they're pretending that that's a perfectly adequate thing to do. You say, you know, we don't say anything, we don't disturb the boat, we just say we're different to Rishi Sunak, they've caused chaos, and we are change. Okay, there'll be a change of face, but that's about all as far as I'm concerned. But the polarisation in politics, from the right, there's a shift towards reform and to an alternative to the Conservative Party. And to the left, I believe, the Workers' Party will represent an alternative to the Labour Party. And I've been a Labour Party member from 17 years of age until 59 years of age last year. So I was a Labour Party member campaigning, particularly keen when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, because I thought that might bring about a genuine change in the Labour Party. They would have a reasonable manifesto, they would oppose war, impose imperialism, prevent Britain from launching new wars around the world, and reorganise the economy for the needs of the majority. But Jeremy Corbyn was removed, and let's be clear, let's not mince out words about this. The Israel lobby was responsible for the removal of Jeremy Corbyn. The Israel lobby. And there's lots of evidence about the Al Jazeera files, the Labour files, it's all online. You can see the videos, the programmes, and the biggest whistleblowing release of information was in history about a political party was the Labour files by Halima Khan. She's standing in Stratford-on-Bow for election there. And she revealed the information, and also I met the press officer under Jeremy Corbyn for the Labour Party yesterday, and he also worked together to release this information, because the Labour Party has become, as they say, as Andrew Feinstein, who's standing against Keir Starmer, said, the Labour Party is a criminal conspiracy against its own members. It is not a democratic organisation. It's a dictatorial organisation controlled by a party machine dominated by the influence of the Israel lobby and some major corporations. And this institution is claiming that they represent change. I don't believe that represents change at all. I believe that in order to bring about change in Britain, we need a fundamental transfer in wealth and power from the top to the bottom. In other words, I don't mean by that squeezing the rich people. I mean taking ownership and control of the military-industrial complex, of the big pharma complex, of the big tech complex, and also of the banks. They control the world today, and they've turned the instruments of liberation, technology, science, culture, art, the internet, computers, the mobile phone, these instruments that should be freeing us and freeing our time have now become instruments of enslavement, to monitor us, survey us, watch over us, and send drones over parts of the world and prepare for laser-guided missiles to blow up men, women and children in Gaza and elsewhere in the world, by the way. And so I believe there needs to be a fundamental transformation, not only in Britain, but across the entire planet, to serve the needs of working people of the world. Working people and the poor of the world are the overwhelming majority. Around 8 people, a few years back this was, Oxfam reported, 8 people own more wealth than half of the world. And half of the world earns less than $2 a day. But under the coronavirus pandemic, those figures were massively exacerbated. Hundreds and hundreds of millions were driven to the point of starvation. And in Britain alone, millions of people have been driven into poverty. And I believe this is a dramatic and desperate situation in the world, and we have to act to transform it. Acting means acting locally and thinking globally. Transforming what happens locally is the beginning of a process of transforming what happens globally. So I've been speaking for a while. I don't want to make it a big propaganda piece, but perhaps you can come in with your contributions, remarks, disagreements and so on. If any of you from different political parties with different points of view, speak on their behalf, from your point of view, how you think about the politics. Because what we found, and unfortunately this is the smallest meeting we've had so far during these hustings debate, but we basically, 3 or 4 of us have been trying to promote these debates, and there becomes a limit to how much we can do on our own, putting up posters and so on, and and attempting to get people along. So if anyone wants to go out and help, put out some posters, get the word out, bring more people along, it will be an enormously transformative event. We have already, in the hustings debates we've had so far, we've had more hustings debates with different political parties, this is the only one where we've only got me so far, than anywhere else in the country to date. So we hope that by the end of the week and early next week, we'll be invigorating democratic debate in this country in a way that should be done during election. In the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1960s, hustings debates were where politics was decided. the members of Parliament would all attend the events. And people would heckle and shout, and you'd respond to them, you'd debate with them, you'd argue with them. That's where the battle took place. And before that, it took place on the streets. People would go out on soapboxes and stand on the street corner, make a speech, and people would argue and debate with them. I still do that at Speaker's Corner. I've been doing that since 1985, standing at Speaker's Corner and speaking in the old tradition of public oratory. And I believe we need to revive that type of methodology of debate and discussion, because otherwise everything is governed by the computer, by the mobile phone, by the internet, and therefore we will be manipulated with artificial intelligence. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that the people will lose power and become dominated by machines and the policies governing, or the people governing those machines, rather than controlling the machines and controlling the society themselves. So thanks very much for coming along. Do participate and make comments, contradictions, disagree with me, argue with me, debate with me, everything else. And then when Peter comes along, you can do the same with him. Put us under a grilling, a proper challenge. That's what I'm here to do. That's why I'm involved in this election. Thank you. Do you want me to answer straight away?
Do I need to summarise for the recording? I probably should. Okay. Heiko said that the main issue, in his view, was Gaza. But polling, this is the question coming from the audience, seems to indicate that actually the main issues for the voters are the cost of living crisis and the NHS. What does Heiko have to say?
I think sometimes necessity expresses itself as through an accident. And the accumulated contradictions and conflicts in society appear over one issue. And I believe that issue is Gaza. And it's not because the other issues aren't important, but because it's inextricably interconnected with them. The cost of living crisis was claimed to be caused by the war in Ukraine, because we declared that the Ukrainians are fighting against a dictatorial regime in Russia, which has seized part of the territory, and it's kind of like 1936, 1938, that Germany is, so where Germany was on the march seizing territory, and that Russia is doing that in Ukraine, and that's why we had to pay for this with energy cuts, which meant we paid higher prices for everything. That was the argument about the cost of living crisis. Of course, the cost of living crisis also had another immediate factor, and that was the expenditure that had been made for 2 years, during which production was dramatically slashed in many countries, nearly every country in the world actually, in the name of fighting against the coronavirus pandemic. And that comes on to the question of the NHS. Firstly, I would recommend that people see a film online called The Great NHS Heist, in which Dr. Bob Gill explains about what has happened to the NHS over the last decades. Since the Blair period, the NHS has been privatised from the point of the internal structure of the NHS. It's still free on demand to the consumer, but it's been privatised internally since that period, from Blair's time up until now. And it is now almost entirely private operation. When you go to the NHS doctors, when Keir Sunak says he's going to introduce 40,000 new appointments, I think it is a week, he said. Appointments, the question is, appointments with who? Who are you going to go and see when you go and see a doctor? Firstly, you're going to have a queue, that might go down by half a day, but who are you going to see when you get to the doctor's surgery? They've employed large numbers, thousands of NHS assistants who are not doctors. They've had 2 years training, not 10 years training. A doctor has 10 years training. So these 2 years trained people are the people you'll be confronting almost every time you go to see the doctor's surgery. I mean, my mother's 89 years of age. She goes to the doctor relatively regularly, but half the time she doesn't know if she's seen a doctor. And she lives only down the road from the doctor. And getting an appointment is a nightmare to get an appointment. And so the story about the NHS is a mythology. They are trying to revive the theory that the NHS is this institution from 1940, introduced originally in 1945, just after the Second World War. In reality, the NHS is a milking cow for big pharma and the big banks and the big building corporations. They're squeezing the taxpayer to extract resources from the NHS. And then the ultimate crime happened under COVID. And this was that they used the excuse of COVID as the mechanism of exacerbating and accelerating the process of privatisation and the process of dominance of big pharma over the NHS. Some of you may know, for example, at 50 years of age, I went to the doctor. The doctor turned around and said, can we take your blood? And they took my blood, and then they came, cholesterol level 7 point something or other. And then they said, the doctor turned around and said, well, we must put you on statins then. So you should put me on, the doctor put me on 40 milligram statins a day. I started getting pins and needles in my feet after 2 days. I had these nightmare dreams of a Pac-Man wandering through my body, eating parts of my body up. And then after a month, the whole of my body was suffering from pins and needles. 25% of deaths in Britain are attributable to misprescribed or misused drugs. 25%. In the United States of America, where the whole process has gone even further, because the consumer has to pay for the privatised healthcare system over there as well, 500,000 people in the last 5 years have been killed by the opioid epidemic promoted by the Sackler company. And you'll see Sackler, I don't know if they've closed them all down now, but they used to have entire sections of the National Gallery and so on were Sackler galleries. These Sackler gallery, the Sackler company promoted opioids as a pain cure, and they got millions of Americans addicted to these opioids, and these are the people you will see. The victims of this are the people you're seeing on the streets on fentanyl and stuff like that in the United States when they show the ghetto pictures today. More in terms of the actual years lost, quality life years lost, more people died in the United States of America in quality life years lost than died during the pandemic from the consequences of closing the hospitals during COVID. So this is an utter international catastrophe caused by giant pharmaceutical corporations who have seized control over healthcare systems around the world. You may not have seen, but in the last few days there was a story came out in Reuters, a detailed investigation study 3 days ago. It's on Democracy Now! If you look at it on the internet, but also on Reuters. And there they showed that the American Defense Department organized a campaign of propaganda in favor of anti-vax policies. They advocated in the Philippines and many other countries where they were using the Chinese vaccine instead of the Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccine. You may remember that in Britain, the British government declared when they injected William Shakespeare, when they injected him, they said, Britain is the #1 country in the world for pharmaceuticals against COVID, because we've injected the first people against COVID. We've got the most rapid accelerated program with the AstraZeneca Oxford jab. That's what they said. The AstraZeneca jab has been banned in pretty much every country in the world now. My brother got the AstraZeneca jab, spent 1 week flat on his back in hospital after getting the AstraZeneca jab. I know a young guy, some of you might know from television. He's been on television interviewed by Piers Morgan. His name is Mohammed Hijab. He speaks at Speaker's Corner. He's a Muslim, great, big, strong, powerful guy. Muscles coming out of his, giant muscle man. Came to Speaker's Corner one summer last year, the year before last, better said, started coughing up blood after the AstraZeneca vaccine. Coughing up blood at Speaker's Corner. Went to the hospital. They told him he had a pulmonary embolism and he could have died. He was a 50% chance of dying. A young man of 29 years of age. Now, this scandal, in my opinion, is going to be far, far bigger than the scandal of HIV-infected blood and the scandal of the post office scandal that we've had in the past year. Millions of people suffered adverse reactions from drugs that had not been properly tested and that were experimental. And only one member of Parliament stood up in the last parliamentary session and explained about what had been happening. And that was Andrew Bridgen. And he had advocated for the vaccinations at the beginning. I advocated for lockdowns at the beginning. But after a while, by the summer, I changed my point of view and come to understand that we were being sold a fraud by Big Pharma and the governments who were in the pay of Big Pharma. And Dominic Cummings admitted this because he went to the Health and Social Care Commission and he said that when the crisis happened, the only team we had was the Brexit team, and so we were dependent on what he called the Bill Gates network. Bill Gates type network and the Patrick Vallance type network who are intimately interconnected with big pharma interests and control the finances of the WHO. And so this is the problem, is that big pharma and big tech, big banks, they've seized control of the world. And that needs to be challenged. And their manipulation of our minds is at the centre of it. Sorry, the gentleman over here, wasn't it?
What is the Workers' Party position? What would you be saying about this?
I believe that big tech needs to be reined in, needs to be taken somehow under control. Now that could be through control over the pipelines, to prevent them from controlling the dominating the whole of the internet and seizing all our information. Security, people need to have their individual security for their intellectual property. So when you use your mobile phone, it should belong to you, what you write, not belong to the tech companies. And so there's about a fundamental charter of rights that needs to be drawn up by the people as to how they relate to the digital world. In relation to big pharma, I think the big pharma companies should be taken into public ownership, and the whole of the NHS should be brought back into public ownership. Honest, and
Can you summarise the question for the
Yeah, the question is, what is a working people? Because everyone's talking about working people now, and I did a little video for the Workers' Party yesterday, and the discussion, and I said, look, it's got the phrase working people in there. Can I say working classes? And the guy told me, no, we'd prefer you say working people. I said, all right, I'll say working people. But I didn't like it, because I don't like the phrase, because it's concealing more than it reveals. I believe the working classes are those who live by selling their labour power, classical Marxist terminology, if you like, selling their labour power for a wage. So those who live from the work they do, from selling their labour power for a wage, and don't have the means to live independently from that. They're not renting out 20 properties and living from the rental income, or they're not living from stocks and shares, then they are the working classes. And as far as I'm concerned, the working classes are at the centre of the politics of the Workers' Party. In other words, some 80% of the population constitute this working classes who are living basically from month to month, year to year. And those who are above. Now, obviously, there's always intermediate people. There are people who are working as a nurse and have got a property as well and getting some rent from a student they're renting to. There are people who are in all these type of circumstances. You know, there are building workers, Polish building workers in the past. They used to be, they would, set up a building company and then start renting rooms out to their mates who they'd bring over from Poland, 6 guys in a room, and there'd be sub-exploiters, and then maybe one of them is renting their bed out to someone else, so it's a sub-exploiter. So there are multiple gradations to this, but basically I would argue about 80% of the population are in the working classes, and then you'll have about 10-15% between the middle to upper middle classes, and then a very small 1-2-3% who actually are what I would call capitalist class, the multimillionaires. And by multimillionaires, I mean, it doesn't mean they don't do work for a living. They don't go and work. They do go and work, but they're administrative, managerial, this type of thing, top-level managerial, administrative, and generally have significant capital resources at their disposal. But even there, the main focus, in my opinion, is on corporate control, not on the individuals. So my own view is corporate is the central question. You must own the big banks, the big corporations, to be able to shift the balance of economic power, because it's not about the individual person and his big house. A lot of people might be discontented that there's someone sleeping on the street outside a big house, but that fundamentally isn't the question. The key question is the corporate power. How do you mobilise resources for investment to develop the economy, rather than what this person's got? Has he got a Rolls Royce or not? Is that adequate, or you want to?
Any other questions? Yes, thank you.
What's the Workers' Party's position on, as is being ignored by the Conservatives and Labour, the position on Europe and Brexit?
Yeah, the Workers' Party, I mean, George Galloway was a supporter of Brexit. I was a supporter of Remain in the European Union. My mother's German. I've spent time living in Germany. I welcomed and I used the rights I had in working and living and renting, and I think that's a hindrance to the younger generation. I think that's the case. But when the vote happened, I mean, I used to debate at Speaker's Corner with people who were in favour of Brexit, and I was against Brexit, but I accepted the vote that had happened, because otherwise the conflict, like in my own family, my mother's German, my brother is a big Brexit supporter, he used to goad her and argue with her, and I remember 2 years of non-stop arguments. where
What's the position of the party?
yeah, well, the party is the party is arguing that Brexit has happened and therefore it has to be accepted. That's the basic argument. You know, the party's position is Brexit has happened. There's no returning to the European Union. That's the position, and that there is, however, or we should, however, seek to make alliances across the world with countries that are sympathetic to the interests of the working classes. So that's the basic position. Yeah. I didn't mean to fluff around.
Well, in France next week, when they have their elections, and the left-leaning group possibly might get some traction. Is that a group that the Workers' Party who support
Yes.
Brexit
Yes.
would try and work with?
Yes, Mélenchon is an ally of George Galloway, and Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany is also an ally of George Galloway. So there is a new constellation of forces emerging in Europe on the left that are allies of ours, and we would seek to make deals with them. If they formed the government, we would make agreements with them and deals with them. Yeah.
Got to go, I'm afraid, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for turning up.
Yeah, I'm sure they will turn up. The Putney one, the Putney Library ones are more likely to have more of the candidates turning up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so much for coming, President. Any other questions?
Yeah, he's arguing. Well, if people are not happy with the current Labour Party, why should they go for the Workers' Party as opposed to the Greens? Yeah. Effectively, yeah. I think there's a clear distinction. The Greens are, in my opinion, and in the party's opinion, are pushing forward proposals that are supported by certain enterprises and corporations that do not have our interests at heart. I don't think the idea of net zero is a good idea. I think we should have a debate, a national debate on the question of net zero, what the implications are for net zero. In my opinion and from my knowledge, net zero would mean a massive fall in living standards for the population in Britain. I don't believe that you can replace gas and petrol with wind power and solar power. I don't think that's a realistic possibility. The other thing is, even if everybody died in Britain tomorrow and Britain was deindustrialised, it would not make the slightest difference to the entire planet as to the amount of emissions released by CO2 or other supposed greenhouse gases. The second point is, as you can probably hear from the sceptical tone that I'm adopting, I do not believe that CO2 is the cause of global warming. CO2 is something produced mainly from the oceans, and it's produced by heat. And so when the sun shines on the sea, it releases CO2. And so CO2 historically, if you look back throughout the history of the last 150,000 years or more, you'll see that CO2 levels rise after warming. So in other words, CO2 is a function of warming rather than the cause of warming. And the argument of the Greens is, and we will have a more thorough debate with the Greens about this in a few days' time.
Tomorrow, I believe.
Tomorrow, there we go. Tomorrow and on Tuesday, I think it is. Then I think they argue, or not, I don't think that, I know they argue that actually what happens, they accept this argument that CO2 comes from heating, but then they say it's a self-reinforcing process. So firstly you get the heating, then you get the CO2, and then they reinforce each other. The actual components of CO2 in the air is about 400 parts per million. If you measured CO2 in this room now, you might have slightly higher than that, because we're in the room, it's a closed environment, the kids have been in the room, they've been using up some of the CO2, and therefore you might have slightly higher than 400 parts per million. But in a submarine, for example, it's perfectly acceptable to have 6,000 or 6,500 parts per million. And people live perfectly well in those circumstances. And in actual fact, to the degree that human beings in the last 150 years have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, they have inadvertently prevented the destruction and disappearance of life on Earth, because CO2 was gradually declining for a period of 10 years, and that decline reached at 1.80 parts per million. And at 150 parts per million, all life on Earth would disappear. And that was the trajectory that would have ended up in about 20,000 years' time had human beings not released CO2 into the atmosphere. So some people might say that's a climate denier. I'm not a climate denier at all. I accept that climate is constantly changing, and that man may have some impact, and in particular, it has an impact around us with pollution and things like this at a ground level. For example, if we build a lot of concrete, then of course the temperature in the area changes because of the lack of vegetation and the amount of concrete that brings in a heat bowl, if you like, effect. But I don't believe that the overall climate on Earth, one, is caused by greenhouse emissions, and two, anything could be done about it even if it was.
I mean, looking at it, since the start of industrialisation, if you want to go back that far, you're looking at an exponential increase in global warming, particularly. It's already reaching a point where large areas of the world, places we know well, are becoming virtually uninhabitable. You can't suggest that that's not primarily human created. That you can have solutions which don't seek to reduce the impact of humans on the planet.
Okay, the gentleman is saying that the proposition I'm making that man is not shaping these events is absurd, basically, is incorrect, is inaccurate. I think that's not correct. I think, firstly, the measures, as I pointed out earlier, firstly, even if the scenario were 100% accurate, nothing we could do in Britain would make the slightest bit of difference. Nothing we could do. We could all die tomorrow, and no way would we change anything that's happening in the world, because the scale of the industrialization process in China and the scale of industrialization and urbanization in India has an enormous effect, and compared to that, what we do in Britain is not even a drop of a pin in the corner of this room. It's nothing. It won't make any difference whatsoever. And therefore you have to ask yourself what the motivations are behind the measures that are being enforced on us that are really quite strict and regimented. All these things, for example, from straws, paper straws made from plants, the massive rush, the pressure to close down the oil fields, the pressure to maintain the coal in the ground rather than take it out of the ground. They all talk about organic. There is nothing more organic than oil and gas. Nothing more organic. That's the very nature of organic. And what they're saying to you on the other side is, organic is like, a tomato grown in a field where you didn't spray it so much. It's a marketing campaign. It's not actually a fact. Organic is basically carbon. Carbon material is what we're made of. We live because of CO2. And if you want to make a plant grow, there's the story. You talk to a plant, you make it grow. Prince Charles used to sit there in his greenhouse and talk to the plant and make it grow. It does make plants grow because you're breathing CO2 on them, and that's what makes them grow. In fact, what happened is, in the last 10 years, you can look up on the internet, NASA greening of the Earth, and you'll see on there that the more CO2 is emitted, the more greening there is. And what happened is, over the last 15 years, is that an area the size of India has been covered by foliage as a result of man emitting increasing amounts of CO2. So I think we need to be able to distinguish between urbanization and pollution. For example, in India, if you go to Delhi, or in Beijing, if you go to Beijing, the whole sky can be, if you like, a sort of yellow haze of dust. That's industrialization and urbanization that is poisoning the air. That's one issue, and that's different from CO2 emitted by industrial processes or by the seas or by man's activity. So I'm disagreeing about the science of it. I don't think the science of it is anywhere near as settled as they make out. And when they come to you with IPCC reports and so on, in fact, IPC is not a scientific committee. I've got a PhD. So when I did my PhD, I discovered you can call yourself a doctor. And when you call yourself a doctor, you can write down an article. And when you write a PhD thesis or you write an article in a scientific magazine, the way it's decided is, what's the thematic which you're talking about? So you can start off your PhD and say, or you can start off an article in a scientific journal and say, the IPCC says that climate change is happening at such and such a rate and it's exponential, and this has been shown to be truth, and that's your starting citation. And then you can say, so I've decided to examine the effect of climate change on West Hill in Putney over a period of a year by examining the foliage in the plants in the area. And then you study the plants in the area for a year, and that will be passing as a scientifically valid investigation. But the initial assumption may be false, but because it's accepted by the so-called consensus, it gets accepted in the scientific journals as fact. And then the sheer weight of money flowing behind this type of research makes it appear that that research is the science. In fact, it's not the science, it's a group of scientists who chose. And if you look at geology, which is the most detailed in terms of the examination of the history of the temperature on Earth, the geologists, overwhelming majority of geologists reject the question, reject the argument. Just one final point. In fact, the temperature fell between 1940 and 1975. Temperature was falling. And that was after, 1945, 1975. That was after the Second World War. In the Second World War, we dropped bombs left, right, and centre. We industrialised the whole of the Soviet Union was industrialised for warfare. The entire economy was mobilised for warfare. And yet, temperatures fell between 1945 and 1975. At a period, and in the period from 1820 up until 1930, there was no significant industrialisation that could have impacted the temperature on Earth. So huge swathes of this period they talk about, 1820 until today, there was no warming and there was no significant CO2. First period, no significant.
What's happening now, what we're hearing now, is that nearly every year is the warmest year ever.
I know. May was apparently the warmest in Britain, but I don't believe it. Yeah, I mean, I'm disputing their evidence. Yeah, for example, last summer, there was talk about how hot it was, and some friends of mine, a lot of friends of mine are green orientated, and I've taken up this issue independently, began to research it, and I've concluded that I couldn't go along with it any longer. And then I can't remember the exact town, but someone said, "Oh, look at the temperature in this place." And then I looked the place up on the map, and it's right next to an airport. And if you look up a lot of the places where they say these are the hottest temperatures, they're right next to airports. And of course they've got high temperatures, because the airport's there. Other places you've got very high temperatures, and they've built concrete blocks in the places. There's a lot of people died in the Hajj yesterday. You might think, like, for me again, that was like, oh, am I wrong? The Hajj happened? What happened is you got tourist companies taking people out there, not giving them water, not giving them shelter, not giving them protection, and then they're dying in the heat in Saudi Arabia. That's what's actually, parasitic companies are using people and putting them in a position where their life's in danger.
We're not talking about things, isolated events happening in particular places. Sorry, we're talking about a consistent trend over the whole planet, which is that we've got global temperatures going up. I don't know, one degree every 10 years or something like that, which is, and it's consistently going up. It's not fluctuating. The line goes up like that, up and down, up and down. I mean, you can't get away from that.
Okay, I recommend to you. The total claim is that since 1820 until now, there's been a 1.5 degree increase in temperature in the whole world. That's the argument they make. And the argument's based upon a guy called Michael Mann. He's a climatologist. Not many of the scientists are climatologists, but he's a climatologist. And there is one single debate internationally in the last 30 years between Michael Mann and people who reject the theory, particularly a guy called Patrick Moore. And there's Judith Curry, Patrick Moore, one Navy guy, and Michael Mann. And there's a debate on that, which I'll put on, for your reference, I'll put on putneyworkers.org. I'll post that on there tonight, and you can look on there. In that debate, which is the only debate where both sides were represented by their leading figures, I suggest you watch that and make your own independent decision as to which you think is likely to be correct based on the arguments presented to you. Because ultimately, in history, even though you can have a lot of scientific papers presented, most people don't go into the nitty-gritty of each detail of the science, and so they accept what the consensus opinion says. And that's what happened to Charles Darwin. That's what happened to, William Smith back in his day in the 1830s. When he said the world was at least 1 million years old, they were rejected. When Darwin said man came from ape, he was rejected. And huge swathes of the community were up in arms saying, how can you make such an outrageous claim? And I believe that we are in a similar situation in relation to climate. But we'll agree to disagree on that. But I'll send you the debate, because it really does have the best figures in the field debating the issues. And I don't believe that there have been many. And it would be great if you come to the debates in a couple of days' time, because this guy will be an expert. I'm not the greatest expert in the field, but I think I'll be able to contradict his arguments adequately.
If you could summarise the question, if you don't.
Yeah, the question was effectively the lobby or the people who argue against man-made climate change and the people who argue in favour of man-made climate change, who are the lobbies who back them? What groups stand to gain as well from that type of argument? And I'm not disputing that certainly were big oil companies and big gas companies who financed people who opposed the idea that man-made climate change was happening. And there are people in what you call the green capitalists. And the green capitalists I would include, for example, climate capture, and Bill Gates is involved, but also some of the big oil and gas companies, because when the mood shifts in society in a particular direction, these are enterprises that want to make money. And so they shift, BP will have all green signs and green adverts. They didn't originally, that's perfectly true. But then later, when they began to feel that the mood was shifting in that direction and the governments were going to give money in that direction, then they were quite happy to take the money to promote those ideas. So at the moment, we have a situation where big oil and big gas, as well as green climate capitalist companies, are all promoting the green agenda. And the green agenda basically results in technology companies that are attempting to create products that can protect the environment, make sustainable buildings, everything, make research on one field or another to protect, to design houses, to design infrastructure. The entire industry of society has been restructured around green objectives. And so there's a huge army of people who benefit from this, quite apart from the scientists and technologists who've been receiving funds and grants to promote these ideas. So in every field, for example, there's a great scientist, perhaps the greatest of our time, and his name is John Ioannidis. It's I-O-N begins. And John Ioannidis at Stanford University, and he's a great Renaissance mind man. And he wrote the most influential paper in modern times, and it's called Why Most Scientific Findings Are False. And this paper is one of the most widely cited papers in history. And he basically goes into the research biases that determine how research is conducted, and therefore why it ends up doing what it does. And we saw the consequences of that during COVID, that the entire scientific community swung behind this, and there was something like 1 million scientific papers published in every single scientific field. And in fact, in the summer of 2022, there was only one field that had not been covered, and that was automotive engineering. But by the autumn, that had also been covered. So every single field of science was captured by the finance that was thrown into supposed research for COVID. I even wanted about to do some myself. At the beginning, I thought, okay, well, my friend's an academic, we can get some funds for doing a research project. And all you had to do was say, look at the condition of the working class. That was what I was going to do. Condition of the working class under COVID. And the fact that you mentioned COVID meant there was, and the grants were coming out, was instituted by an organisation called Innovate.uk, launched by Dominic Cummings. They were given £100 million almost immediately, and you could apply for grants up to £500,000 and get a nod and a wink and get the grant within a week, just by having one academic institution and one private enterprise operating together to do that. Within a week, you'd get the grant. So this shows you how you can mobilise a consensus out of nothing. Okay. So it's a bit more of a, just for those who couldn't hear. It's fine. It's because of the audio setup. It's a bit more detail on the question about the specifics of the type of companies that might be doing almost like things that appear irrational from the point of view of this discussion. But I think because the sheer scale, they've thrown out resources into huge fields, huge range of fields. For example, the methane argument is that methane is far stronger, warmer than CO2. Something like 100 times more powerful in a warming effect.
specifically methane thing, it was they were like trying to reduce methane leakages from
Yeah.
gas operations.
Yeah. I mean, at one time, Clinton was also arguing that methane was a bigger threat than CO2, and something you could do more about. In fact, a lot of the methane comes from termites, and there are trillions of termites on Earth, far more than there are human beings, and they eat wood. They're the only animals that can do that, and when they eat wood, they emit methane, and the methane gets circulated into the air and and actually is a warming gas. That really does cause some level of warming, but in actual fact, I think you'll find that the whole process of advocacy for different groups, you're going to have it no matter what. You're going to any argument or debate that involves finances and money being thrown around and profitable operations, you'll have proponents of it and opponents of it. The issue about the misnomer comes, in my opinion, from the term climate change itself. Climate change is something that everybody basically must accept is happening. What that climate change means is another question. Does it mean cooling? Does it mean warming? There was a piece in The Guardian a couple of days ago where they showed that there's an attempt to seed the clouds in the United States, in a part of the United States, and then they warned, from the basis of a model from a computer, that the consequence of seeding the clouds there could be catastrophic elsewhere in the world. And so, you have to be careful what you wish for in these type of things. Let's imagine that temperatures really were governed by a button of CO2, and that you then turned around and said, in the United States, for example, temperatures have not been rising for the last 20, 30 years. It's one of the anomalies within the things. Some parts of the world as a whole, but other parts are not. So if you were then to be able to capture the CO2 and it was actually causing temperatures to remain or to rise, then in the United States, the temperatures would fall. And what would that mean? In actual fact, more people die from cold weather than from warm weather. Human beings cannot survive below 10 degrees centigrade, at least not without clothing on and special facilities. And so that's why we had struggled to live in the Northern Hemisphere. And so I think the argument is a bit of a misnomer. There's a lot of fog, there's a lot of material produced, and the pressure is always there for you have to accept, otherwise you're a denier. In fact, some people from the Palestinian group in Wandsworth, they said they were debating whether they should support my candidacy. And then one of them turned around to me and said, "You're a climate denier." I said, "What do you mean a climate denier? I'm not denying climate changes. I'm not denying that you need to mitigate against climate changes. I'm just denying that the evidence is not that strong as they're making out, that CO2 is the button controlling the temperature on Earth." That's my argument.
Firstly, thank you very much for coming today, and I've seen you outside Putney Station as well, so I know you're putting like an enormous amount of effort into the campaign and everything, which is great.
Can I just clarify as
It's great
well?
to see.
I'm working full time, so it's fantastic. We need help from people, and I've said to the other candidates they're welcome to help me too, and obviously they're not.
No, it's